Good morning, everybody. We will get meeting 3 for the joint subcommittee to study the consolidation and scheduling of general elections started. And first, we will take roll.
Senator Sorovo, Senator Deeds, Delegate Price, Delegate LaVere Bowling, Delegate Helmer,
Here.
Delegate Bloxham, Delegate Ballard, Commissioner Susan Beals,
Here.
Honorable Lisa L. Lucas Burke, Honorable Jessica Schneider, David Levy, Tracy Howard, Senator Van Valkenburg.
Here.
Senator, you have a quorum.
Thank you. So we have a list of 6 presenters here, and we're not gonna, I'm gonna use the chair's prerogative, we're not gonna ask each one individual questions as they go, because we're just gonna get bogged down and that's not necessary. So what we'll do is we'll hear the first 2 presentations first, and I know they got a jet, so we'll hear their 2 presentations first. We'll do a quick Q&A so that you guys can get out of here. And so we'll start with Dean Lynch from VACO.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the Joint Subcommittee. I'm Dean Lynch, Executive Director of the Virginia Association of Counties, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today and for accommodating my schedule. I appreciate the chance to offer a county perspective, particularly from a financial standpoint, on consolidating elections into the federal cycle. We have begun discussing this topic with our members, including our Finance and Elections Steering Committee and our Board of Directors. Feedback has been mixed. Some members welcome the potential to reduce voter and volunteer fatigue, while others are concerned that local issues could be overshadowed by federal races. For context, most Board of Supervisors seats are on the ballot in odd-numbered years, with 158 seats up this November and 393 seats up in 2027. Let me talk just a minute about the local role in election administration. Virginia law assigns primary responsibility for funding elections to localities. Counties cover staff salaries, compensation for officers of election, polling places, equipment, ballot printing, postage, and other election-related costs. The state provides partial reimbursement for registrar and electoral board salaries, covering roughly 77% and 81% respectively, as well as periodic support such as reimbursement for presidential primaries and limited ad hoc funding. In FY23, counties spent approximately $55.6 million on elections, with $7.9 million reimbursed by the state. In 2024, total costs rose to $67.6 million, with $12.5 million provided by the state, and the balance from local revenues. These figures include both annual administrative expenses and election-specific costs. If elections were consolidated into even years, savings could be realized on election-specific costs such as polling places, ballot printing, postage, and stipends for officers of election. General registrars could provide additional detail on these distinctions, which I think you're going to hear from a little bit later. Election administration has become more complex, and counties continue to advocate for a stronger state partnership in meeting these ongoing responsibilities. We appreciate recent efforts, such as proposals for full reimbursement of registrar and electoral board compensation, and welcome the continued collaboration on funding solutions. Let me talk just a minute about bond referenda and other ballot questions. We also thank Senator Sorovo for raising the issue of bond referenda. Counties are constitutionally required to seek voter approval before issuing general obligation bonds, and these referenda are typically held during the November general election cycle. From 2016 through 2025, counties placed referenda before voters each year, with some counties doing so regularly. Counties must also seek voter approval in other cases, such as imposing a 1% sales tax for school capital projects, changing school board selection methods, establishing certain authorities, or creating county police departments. It is important that counties retain the flexibility to place these referenda before the voters, even outside of an even year election cycle. In closing, I just want to thank you again for the opportunity to present these perspectives. We regret that we may miss some of today's discussion, but we'll review the proceedings and remain available to provide further information at the committee's request. Thank you.
Great, and in my rush to get these guys out the door for their time, I forgot to contextualize today's meeting, and so just as a reminder for everybody listening and for everybody on the dais that today we're focusing on the money, and we're going to look at how election consolidation would impact finances of the local governments in the states and such. And so next we have Michelle Gowdy from VML.
Good morning. I am not Michelle Gowdy, but Chair Van Valkenburg and esteemed members of the Commission. It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning. My name is Kelly Burke, and I am the mayor of the town of Leesburg and the vice president of the Virginia Municipal League. I want to start by thanking you for the invitation and the opportunity to speak before you this morning as a representative of local governments. First, I want to say that I am no stranger to elections. I was first elected to the Leesburg Town Council in May of 2004. I was 12. No, I'm only kidding. In 2007, I was elected to the Loudoun County Board of Supervisors. I was re-elected to the Town Council in 2012 during a special election, and then I became the vice mayor and then elected mayor in 2016, a role I currently hold. I say all of this to demonstrate the knowledge and the experience I have with the election in towns and counties, during special elections, during regular elections, in May elections, and November elections. I've done them all. So for me, the elections are very close to my heart, and I value each vote that is placed during the election. But I have some serious concerns about the moving of the elections to even years. For over 170 years, Virginia has maintained a distinctive electoral calendar, purposely setting apart from federal elections. This tradition traces back to our 1850 Constitution. After its ramification, the Commonwealth held its first election to governor, and since then, Virginia has preserved off-year elections that fall on odd-numbered years. This design ensures that state and local officials, from governors to delegates, county officials and town councils, and mayors appear on the ballot in years separate from presidential or congressional contest. It was not imposed by accident, but crafted with intention to shield local leadership elections from national partisan influence and shine a focused light on community issues. For generations, Virginia has intentionally held elections separately from federal contacts, and that choice was not by accident. It was rooted in the belief that local government should be close to the people, nonpartisan in tone, and focus on everyday needs that touch our lives.
Excuse me. We understand all the philosophical implications of this. The ask was for the financial implications for cities.
Local governments pay for the majority of the cost. Local governments pay for the majority of the costs with administration of elections, except the general register salaries and versus the system. Local governments fund the entire election. Some examples of expenses localities pay are for hiring staff and poll workers, training staff, mileage reimbursement for staff training, painting ballots, security, updating software, voting machines, and absentee and early voting. Some localities only have 2 precincts, others have more than 100, so they're affected differently in terms of training. The level and duration of the training will likely need to increase for both part-time and full-time staff members. Localities pay for all training that staff is required to obtain, so with an overall increased level of training, costs may not decrease. Additionally, the cost of printing and mailing ballots will increase because of the increased number of candidates, referendum, and bonds. This also may require ballots to be 2 pages and extremely long, which some voting machines may not be able to handle. I could talk more on this, but I will stop at this point since you're only looking at the cost. But I would encourage you to consider allowing towns to continue to be on the odd election years.
All right, we'll do a brief Q&A before we move on.
Good morning. I wanted to see, I actually have 2 questions, Mr. Chairman. First for Mr. Lynch, if we were to do the consolidation that you, when you were talking about the impact on counties, I'm not from a county. So I just want to understand, I hear you want to retain the right to be able to do the ballot questions regardless of consolidation, right? Because you guys do them potentially every year now, right? Okay.
Just about every year, yes, ma'am.
With that, because I do want to make sure that the impact on voter is also brought to our conversations, what would you anticipate? I'm asking for you to see the future. What would you anticipate a turnout for an election would be if it was just for your county's ballot question in an odd year?
I'm assuming that it would be very, very low turnout.
Understood. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Ms. Gowdy?
It'd have to be a really something that.
Right. It would depend on the topic, I'm sure. But I just wanted to raise that to our consciousness of we want to do things that increase turnout. This is something we need to consider. Thank you so much. Excuse me, Mayor Burke is what I should have said instead of Mr. Is it Ms. Gowdy? She's not here. No. Burke is. Oh, okay. Thank you. Now, you were given just a brief amount of time, so I'm asking you just to kind of expand. I was not expecting you to say that it might cost more. I definitely was expecting you to say cost savings. Is there something that you could expound upon when you were listing the items that might cost more? Because I guess I just don't understand if you're, like, let's say if we have 5 candidates one year, 10 candidates the other year. The mailing is to 15 candidates. If you had a year where all 15 were having things, you still have to mail to 15 candidates. So I'm just trying to see specifically how it would impact it to potentially cost more.
Well, there's different ways that it would cost you more. One is by training. You're going to end up you're going to lose people because you're not doing it every year now. You would end up having to do more training. Many of the people would become part-time, so then you would also have to bring in new people that might not necessarily know, so you end up with training issues and costs that weren't expected there. The machines are used every year now. If you're not using the machines and they sit for a while, is there any implication to that? Then you're going to have to check them out, make sure that they're working and that they're accurate, which we do now, but you're going to have to do it in a much more precise way. And then the mailings and things of that nature will increase because of the amount of population where I'm from, the population changes quite often. And so there's issues like that. I don't know if Ms. Boulevard would like to add anything more to that, but the costs are a concern.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, this is for, I think, first for Mr. Lynch and then for Mayor Burke. So, Mr. Lynch, I think you said it was $55.6 million, of which you were reimbursed $9 million in 2023 across counties, and then $67.6 million, of which you were reimbursed $12.5 million. So you're looking on average somewhere between $40 and $50 million across all counties to administer elections annually. I'm not asking you for precision, but from what I've heard is you're going to go from printing ballots 2 years instead of 1 year, postage from 2 years instead of 1 year instead of 2 years. You're going to go for paid staff at polling locations, and most times, except when you have from 2 years instead of. Do you have a sense? I mean, are we talking 20% cost savings, 40% cost savings, given you'll still have some annual run rate expenses like registrars and things like that? What are we talking about?
You know, Delegate, I don't have a percentage right there on what kind of savings that would be, but you know, as I said, there would be savings.
Mr. Chair, just follow. I mean, would it be reasonable? Do you have a sense then, at least, of the variability of that? I mean, I imagine we're not going to save all $67.6 million that you would spend on in 2024, but I imagine most of that cost is actually directly related one time to the administration of an election, minus the reimbursement for the registrars, which you're already getting. So you're already getting the state money in those regardless. So I mean, I think you're going to come pretty close to zero outside of there. Unless, is that wildly off when you just think about the buckets of costs that are there?
If you don't mind, let me phone a friend real
That'd be great.
Katie Boyle, Deputy Director of VACO.
Good morning. What we've provided, the localities report to the Auditor of Public Accounts every year, and the auditor compiles all that into this comparative report. And so that's where that number is drawn from, overall spending. And then the APA staff have been kind enough to help us sort of extricate what came from the state and what came from other sources. So it is just a big bucket of everything that was spent to support elections. So we would probably have to work with the registrars to kind of parse that out. There is some variability, as you point out, in terms of sort of how many elections are run in a year, but yeah, that is including kind of the ongoing costs, supporting the registrar's office, electoral board, staffing, et cetera, then plus the kind of election-specific breakdown. So I think we'd probably have to maybe work with the registrars, and they may have some more specific, information to share with you later. We talked a little bit with them in advance of the meeting. I think they'd probably be the source of kind of what's ongoing, recurring, and what's sort of election-specific.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm really bad at this. There it goes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just for
Yep. Delegate Homer.
just for Mayor Burke, it sounds like the Virginia County Commission thinks that they're going to drive cost savings. Is there a reason that towns are going to spend more on elections if we reduce the number of elections versus counties? Or will we expect it also to drive down the cost?
That will be the increase in the number of voters. The town in Leesburg, we did go with the elections, thinking that would bring more people out, and that would be really great. And it did. It does bring more people out. For us, it was a real hardship because people they came to vote for president and they didn't know anything about the local elections. So your increase will be in the number of people, the number of early voting. People that are really interested in voting for the president will come out more often than they do at the local and state level. But there's a disadvantage to that because they don't know anything about the local or state races.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it.
Hold on.
Yeah.
I'm confused because how is there more voters when we're subtracting an entire year's worth of voters? So that doesn't.
More voters come out.
But don't they come out in even years anyway?
No. I mean, they come out in even years because it's a presidential race. But in the odd years, they're less likely to come out. So a smaller number come out because they're not voting for president.
Right, but if we consolidate elections, we're going to have less voters overall because we're going to be subtracting an entire year's worth of voters from voting.
You could look at it that way, but
I think that's the only way to look at it.
well, no, because I think we're talking about two different things.
So what are you talking about?
I'm talking about the impact of having. Like printing ballots, okay? If you're going to have more people come to the even elections, so you will be printing more ballots than you would on the odd times, much more so than you would. So you're going to be printing more than you would if you just combine the two of them.
But we still wouldn't be printing them in odd years at all anymore. Yeah,
Well, that's
it's okay. Yep. Supervisor Schneider.
I know I spoke with our registrar, and she seemed to have a similar. It's more about capacity of the number of voters that come out at one. In total, if we consolidate, because then you're going to have to handle a larger number of voters at one time. I think that's. She also was concerned about the other thing that they were talking about as far as having to. We wouldn't be able to keep staff on year-round, and then we're going to have to try to find staff every other year because you can't really keep and to find part-time staff is not really the easiest thing to do, and then train them, et cetera. So,
thank you.
Yes, I'd like to ask just a point of clarification for our speakers. Are all of our local elections, county, cities, towns, on the state cycle except for special elections or vacancies? Are they on the 2 4-year state cycle? Do we have a 3-year cycle for some positions?
So Katie Boyle again with VACO. The counties and the department has a really helpful document where they break out which seats are up in which years. Counties are on, either our seats are 25 or 27 or 29, but Arlington County has, because of their form of government, has some seats up in even years, 26 and 28.
Okay.
That's the counties. Thank you.
All right, thank you, guys. We're gonna move on, and we're gonna get to House and Finance, Appropriates and Finance staff. So we got Mike and Kim here. And so, Mike, why don't you take it away?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So for the members of the commission, my name is Mike Tweedy. I'm staff to Senate Finance and Appropriations, and Kim McKay from House Appropriations staff is here as well. So we have a very brief presentation just to kind of talk about, I know the resolution talked about the state budget process and if that should change if the election cycle is changed. So we're just going to briefly talk about how they're tied together and how they kind of relate to one another. So just starting off, like I said, just looking like an overview of Virginia's budget cycle. So one thing I think is an important point to realize too is like the Constitution, when it comes to the state budget, really just talks about the power to appropriate funds from the state treasury. It has limitations on appropriations, as well as the effective date of a General Appropriation Act. The budget process itself and the cycle is actually laid out in the Code of Virginia under Title 2.2. It's under the Department of Planning and Budget's authority. It lays out the governor submitting the budget bill and that whole process. So that's only kind of on the code. The general thing I'll say about Virginia's budget cycle is traditionally when it's been thought about in a number of years ago, there was a bill introduced every year. It was actually, I think the last year was 2018. It was Senator McDougal. He wanted to change the budget cycle to align with the gubernatorial term in a different way. And the main thing there is, and we're about to experience that, is when the new governor is elected and comes in January, a new biennial budget will have been proposed by the current governor. And so that's what I think years ago Senator McDougal was trying to attempt to change, sort of that cycle, so that the new governor would not have to sort of execute a budget that they really had limited involvement in. I will say that oftentimes, when a new governor comes in, the General Assembly will oftentimes give them the opportunity to submit executive amendments, or other priorities could be considered in that process. But again, the new governor wasn't really involved in developing the details of that budget. So that was the issue that he was trying to resolve. So I'll kind of just briefly walk through the years. So when you look at year one, what happens is when the new governor comes in, of course, they're dealing with whatever the outgoing budget governor had proposed. And then, of course, in the fall of their first year, they will propose in December of that year an amended budget for their second session that they will deal with. And so it's not till the fall of their second year in office that they actually go through the process of developing a new biennial budget that'll be considered in their third term. And so really that's sort of the kind of the old adage is that the governor really gets to propose and execute one biennial budget in their 4-year term. So that's really kind of from the budget side. And then they would ultimately conclude in their outgoing budget proposing a biennial budget. The one thing I will note is that regardless of what the timeline is for the budget cycle, you're always going to have the situation where a governor comes in January and they're dealing with a budget proposed by the previous governor. The question is it a new biennial budget, new 2-year budget, or is it an amended budget to the 2-year budget? So in other states, they have entirely different budget processes because their legislature goes much longer in the year. So sometimes their governors propose things at the beginning of a year. But Virginia's, of course, sessions and cycle doesn't really support that. So you really can't resolve that unless you completely change, I think, the entire legislative process. So that's generally how the cycle goes. What would happen is, compared to years ago when Senator McDougal was trying to change the process, he was trying to change the budget process to match that. If you change the election cycle, it automatically does that. You would change it so that, essentially a governor would be elected in an even year and come in and basically deal with an outgoing budget, an outgoing governor's proposed amended budget. So it sort of changes that whole cycle. And so technically a governor, would be more involved in 2 biennial budgets in their term. So really, if the, I think what the resolution talked about was, and the direct impacts to Virginia's budget cycle is if you change the election cycle, the budget cycle for a governor has changed. The question is really, then would you want to change it back to the way it is today? So that, the new governor would consider the same biennial budget of an outgoing governor. So that's really the change, because if you change the election cycle, the underlying budget cycle does not change because it's established in the code in the current cycle. So with that, like I said, it sort of fixes that thing from years ago that Senator McDougal was trying to fix, but basically the election cycle and the budget cycle, it's like that's basically how they're kind of related. So I'll let Kim kind of talk about a little bit about how elections are paid for in Virginia in the next 2 slides. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. So moving on, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because you already heard about this from speakers already this morning. But here's a quick overview how elections are paid in Virginia from a state budgeting perspective. The cost and responsibility, as you've already heard, for elections administration primarily falls to localities, but the state does provide support through the budgeting process for personnel cost with about $11 million a year, and that's distributed based on population, and that exists in the budget in that item. We also provide support for presidential primaries, and that is mandated by the code. Last presidential primary, that support was about $7 million a year. Also provide for a centralized voter registration system. And then we've done in the past through budget some one-time support for elections administration during emergencies. The one that comes to mind is that the state provided about $2 million through a special appropriations bill to provide support for local registrars to offset costs related to postage for mailing absentee ballots during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so just to kind of summarize what Mike and I have kind of given you a quick overview, changes to the Virginia's budget cycle are not needed if the General Assembly and voters decide to advance a plan to move state and local elections to even years. That's a policy choice up to the General Assembly. But moving the election cycle without moving the budget cycle does shift the balance of power between the governor and the legislature by giving the governor additional power. So where things stand now, you all have the ability to react to the governor's outgoing biennial budget and get to craft the biennial budget moving forward for a new governor to deal with. So there are some power shifting issues related to all of this. And then the state general fund impacts due to the way we pay for and support local elections are likely to be minimal because we are focused on personnel cost. But the General Assembly could provide support to help with the transition to localities. And based on the presentations and speakers so far, that work is underway to decide if there'll be a need for some one-time funding to maybe help with the transitions, and that's certainly up to the discretion of the General Assembly through the budgeting process, if that support would be provided, and whether or not there'll be ongoing cost savings to local elections offices. And with that, that concludes Mike and I's brief presentation.
Okay, we have a couple questions for you. Delegate Price.
Go to the second floor. Sorry. Question. I'm very visual. Our items. Is it possible on the slide where you have how it works now to do below it exactly what you said in words about what the power balance shift would be so that we could have that visual for comparison. I hear the words and understand that, but just when the public goes back to the slides, I think it would be important to have that visually as well.
Yeah, we could definitely do that. It's, because I know it gets very confusing because, terms of office or budget cycle is a July 1 through June 30.
Exactly.
So like just fiscal years don't really align even with the terms of office of any elected member.
Understood. Thank you. And then, Mr. Chair, I just had one question. Thank you. Did you say it was like $11 million for the presidential primary in 2024?
Delegate Price, it's, the personnel cost is $11 million, presidential primary, $7 million is provided.
Okay, thank you. And then, Mr. Chair, just wondering if yeah, thank you. So then speaking of consolidation, but bringing it down to a micro level, the presidential primary consolidation to a general election primary, would that have brought us some cost savings in 2024?
Delegate Price, Mr. Chair, I'm wanting to think about that a little bit more, but my initial reaction to your question is likely no, because that we just have to cover the cost of the presidential primary, and that is determined by working with the local elections offices, and we've adjusted that kind of for inflation over time, and so that's kind of set in the code, and I'd want to look back at the code to see if I could give you a better answer on cost savings, but my initial reaction is no.
Mr. Chair, is it possible? Thank you. Can I ask that of a representative from the local government then? Because just the math this morning for me is not mathing. It seems like if you're having fewer things, that there would be fewer costs. So can you answer that from a local perspective? Would there be cost savings if the presidential primary and the general election primary occurred on the same day instead of a March election and a June election? Yeah, but we got it here. I mean,
I would probably want to confer a little bit with the registrars. It would seem to me that you'd have some economies of scale, but I'd probably like to talk with the registrars a little bit. I mean, if everyone were sort of going to the polls at the same time and you had multiple ballots, I mean, it would seem to me that rather than have two separate elections.
Can I cut in? Can I cut in? So if we have, Delegate Helmer and I had this bill to consolidate presidential and general election primaries. Is it not true that when we have two separate primaries in a presidential year, we have to twice send out absentee ballots to everybody?
That would be my expectation.
Second question is it not true that we would have to have two 45-day early voting cycles for those primaries?
I think that's right.
So if we consolidated to one, wouldn't we be sending out less paper and postage and spending less money on volunteers?
I think.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Delegate Helmer.
All right, Mr. Chair, if everybody could stay, just so I want to make sure I clarify what the different buckets of expenses are, because I think it'll answer to Delegate Price's point here. It seems to me that the General Assembly, through the budget, covers a set of essentially fixed costs. A registrar stays there year over year, no matter how many elections we have. So from the perspective of the General Assembly, with that, accepting our support to presidential primaries, we are essentially filling a hole at the county that changes presumably based on inflation and the cost of personnel only, but it's fixed from our perspective. The counties, on the other hand, deal with printing ballots, opening polling sites, playing with the locations, and those costs are highly variable. So my understanding from what we are hearing thus far, and if you can confirm, I'm not asking you for a number or percentage, is from the perspective of our budget, it doesn't matter from a state level if we have one election a year, one election every other year, or one election every 2 years, because we're going to be paying for registrars, and the only thing that's variable beyond that is the price for presidential primaries. At the county level, the number of elections matters deeply, because the county is responsible for picking up the paper, the postage, the personnel to open polling sites, the early location of voting. So every single election we have incurs additional costs for the taxpayer. And so I would assume two things. One, if we were to move elections to the even year, the cost to the state, if we keep the law the same, is going to be essentially unchanged. The cost to the counties is going to it's probably not going to quite cut in half because they have personnel costs that go over a year. But essentially, the cost of that election that we were going to do that year is mostly going to go away. And we can figure out if that's 80% of the cost or 70% of the cost, but it's a substantial amount. Same thing with the presidential primary year. If a locality has to do 3 elections in a year with 135 days of early voting, it's going to cost a lot more than doing 2 elections in a year with 90 days of early voting. Is anything I've just, the real question is, anything I have just said wrong in terms of capturing the overall cost structure in this?
Mr. Chair, Delegate Homer, you certainly landed where Mike and I landed on the state budgeting perspective. So that's exactly what we were trying to communicate to you.
Okay. From the counties?
Yes, thank you. I'm in agreement, and I think it's just the question that we don't have numbers for today is sort of the amount of the savings, which I think we could certainly work with the registrars to put some dollar figures to. But I agree with how you've distinguished between recurring ongoing costs and then election-specific costs.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, just speaking to that, so just again, like what we are hearing is consolidating elections in any sense. We've heard 2 things. One is there's going to be increased turnout in local elections that happen in lower turnout cycles now, so there will be more people showing up for elections. And there's a question before us about whether that means that local issues get short shrift, but we will have more voters showing up to vote on local issues. And we will be doing so overall on a 2-year basis at much lower cost to the taxpayer. So if we were to move forward with this consolidation, we would see that you would need less money for elections. You would have more people turn out for those elections. And then the question is overall, like, does that benefit how we make decisions or not? But like the actual fiscal implications seem clear. And then there's a second the question on balance of power in the budget is a separate question, an important one that doesn't have it doesn't have any fiscal implications. It does have questions about how we would make sure that the General Assembly retains, if we want to go that route, retains its power in discussions with the governor over the future of the budget. So I really appreciate this testimony. Has been really clarifying, but I think that's where we've landed.
Elections are set by the legislature, really, and separate from the election cycle for state primaries and state elections. So I don't see us necessarily saving by consolidation. Is that not true?
I can take that. It was the senator and I did that bill. The answer is you are correct, sir. Currently, we set the dates for the presidential primaries. We set the dates for state and local primaries. Several years ago, I don't know, it was before I was here, we moved to Super Tuesday so that Virginia would be impactful in its primary selections in elections. And the question on those years right now, if we have a federal or a local primary, the locality ends up having to foot the bill not only for the presidential primary, which takes place in March during Super Tuesday, but also for a June primary that we've set the date for. The proposal on this proportion of consolidation, which the General Assembly did pass but was vetoed by the governor, would be to readjust the second primary that would happen to occur only in those presidential years in March. And so therefore the locality would save substantial sums of money because instead of having 135 days of early voting in that year, they would have 90 days of early voting. Instead of having 3 election days in the year, they would have 2 election days. And so you would see savings proportional to whatever we find out the variable costs are of about a third of the total cost to taxpayers right now in a year in which there was a channel. That's how it would impact it.
And I know we have the registrars coming up, but when the local government breaks out the money, I would love to see like specifics of what are the costs that are just the same no matter what. Because we heard a lot about how training is going to go up, but you train every year. You have to train election workers every year. So there is a consistent cost there no matter what. And so if we could get like a breakdown of those permanent costs as opposed to those election-specific costs. That would be great. Any other questions for Appropriates and Finance staff? Because if not, we'll take up Susan. All right, thanks, guys. Next, we have Susan Beals, Commissioner of Elections. She's going to talk from the Department of Elections perspective.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to present this morning about the budget considerations of consolidating elections to even years from the perspective of the Virginia Department of Elections. Just to level set, I wanted to detail the basic functions of the department. As you can see here, the ongoing basic functions are to maintain the voter registration system, which includes updating voter lists with new registrants, removing those who become ineligible, certifying voting systems to Virginia standards, training local election officials through annual in-person training, online training, cybersecurity training, and emergency preparedness tabletop exercises, processing candidate qualification documents, and in some cases, petitions, maintaining the campaign finance reporting system and ensuring compliance, tracking and implementing legislation that's passed by these bodies, producing mandated reports to the General Assembly, responding to FOIA requests, providing public information and training on voter registration to third parties and voter education campaigns prior to each election, and then, as mentioned, reimbursing localities annually for general registrar and electoral board salaries, and then once every 4 years for presidential primaries. And finally, updating, printing, and mailing forms to local election officials, including forms such as voter registration forms and provisional ballot envelopes. Currently at the department, we have 67 staff members and 6.2 million registered voters. We have a $22 million operating budget, and as mentioned, $11 million passes through us for general registrar and electoral board salaries. When you look at other states that you could compare us with who are running on even elections, a lot of other states have a Secretary of State model where they have someone who's elected, they have an elections division under that. I tried to find some states that are very similar to us in that they have a State Board of Elections and an appointed executive director or chief election official. So I looked at Maryland and North Carolina. They both have even year elections. Maryland has 4 million voters. They have roughly 55 staff members. North Carolina has 7 million voters. They have roughly 70 staff members. So that is what you're seeing they're maintaining year over year, even though they're only holding elections on even years. When I talk to my colleagues at other states about what they do in their off year, this is what they tell me. They say they're working to redesign their website. They're doing their list maintenance functions. They are doing IT procurements and projects and builds, and they're doing outreach projects and partnerships. Most other states are not running a confirmation mailing during their even years. They're doing it in their odd years because it's just easier. It's very, very tricky for us to do a confirmation mailing and make sure we're staying within the dates under MVRA. It's like landing a helicopter on the head of a pin. You got to make sure that you get it just right so that you're staying within all of those requirements. This is what other states are doing every year, like us. They are still tracking legislation because their public bodies are passing legislation every year that has to be implemented. They are maintaining their voter registration system because people register every day. People die every day. People get convicted every day. People move every day. And so that constantly has to be updated. Voter education goes on, training of election officials if there are changes to legislation, voting system certification, which is new voting systems that come on the market that have to be certified. That has to happen all the time, and then FOIA compliance has to happen all the time as well. To dive into the presidential primary reimbursement discussion a little deeper, so I tried to give you some historical background. In 2020, when we had our presidential primary, that was before all of the new early voting innovations were passed. And so that shows you a good example of with and without the 45 days of early voting, what that cost is. So in 2024, general registrars submit expenses to us and then we reimburse them. In 2024, they submitted $11 million in expenses, but we were only appropriated $7 million. So we paid that out to them on a prorated basis. So the two areas of potential savings that I would see for the Department of Elections, we do operate call centers for the 45 days of early voting, both for the primary and the general every year. That's about a $200,000 a year savings. We also, the printing of forms and envelopes, that runs you anywhere from $80,000 in an odd year to $140,000 in an even year. So we would probably see some savings in terms of having to print and mail forms to localities. And that's it. I'm happy to answer any questions. I also wanted to note, too, I'm going to be presenting to you all in September on election administration. So if there are topics you'd like me to cover there, let me know, and I'm happy to prepare that.
Delegate Helmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've succeeded in the microphone. This is a really interesting presentation. Thank you for doing that. Operational question for you. So in those even year states, to what extent is volume a cost for you? So I imagine like registration is tied very closely to elections. Registrations go up as elections get closer. Are there operational and cost impacts of issues like registration and absentee ballots that go beyond just like the mailing and printing costs there, but in terms of like what you have to deal with as a department that would reduce if you were to move to an even year? I imagine there's cost elements. I also imagine there's just operational complexity. And if you could talk a little bit to how that changes if the cycle changes where you're not seeing it every year.
Mr. Chair, Delegate Helmer, I would say typically in a presidential year, we see something on the par of about 400,000 people register to vote. An off year is about 200,000. That's the 3 off years in between. So it is double typically in a presidential year in terms of the number. But because every single person who goes through the DMV for any transaction is updating their voter registration, there is a certain consistent level of registration that we see. And I would suggest that the majority of the cost of that is going to fall on localities because they're the ones that are having to print, mail voter registration confirmation notices to those individuals. They're doing the data entry on their side. Our system is merely capturing it from DMV and sending it down to the locals.
One more quick follow-up, Mr. Chair. Is there anything that you are doing today? I mean, you're roughly proportional to your analogs in Maryland and North Carolina, but I am wondering when you look at, you are slightly above them in terms of total personnel to voters. Do you think if you were to reduce to 2 years that ultimately that the number of people in the department would be the same? Are there things that people are doing today that would, now that you amortize it over a 2-year period, you would, that those functions would eventually go away? I'm not putting you on the spot to say I should be at 64 instead of 67 4 years from now, but I am curious if you think there are tasks that are, because they're annualized instead of biannualized, that you might be able to reduce cost over time as well.
Chairman Van Valkenburg, Delegate Helmer, I typically, when I go to conferences with other state election officials, they look at me with a really pitiful face and say, I'm sorry, you have to do it all every year. Because we have to do everything every year. And I think that we are making a lot happen with a small amount of people. So I would not foresee us necessarily reducing staff.
Got it. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Last follow-up. Delegate Price has reminded us many times about the voters in the conversation, which I think is right. Are there things that you think we would be able to do better for voters, for citizens of the Commonwealth? Because you mentioned some of the voter confirmations and things like that, but are there things that if we didn't have elections every year, when you look at it from a Department of Elections perspective, where you think we would spend more time on customer interface or questions? Are the things that because of the volume are harder to do today that might be easier to do, that might make the voter experience better? And it's okay if you need to come back to me.
Yeah, that could be there September. The heavy one to drop.
Yeah, we can also answer that in September as well.
I can also what?
We're going to be talking about this in September, so we could have you come back and talk about that in September.
That sounds good.
Mr. Levy.
There has been some talk of impact on voting machines to have a consolidated ballot. Do you foresee the current state of technology in voting machines in Virginia being able to handle the transition to a consolidated ballot for even year elections?
Chairman Van Valkenburg, Mr. Levy, I do think that there is concern about having a 2-page ballot. You do sometimes tend to see voters drop off towards the bottom of those ballots in terms of what they're voting for. It also, and I would be happy to talk about this more later too, but you would also have to consider the impact on some of the auditing that we do, like a risk limit audit, what that looks like. You're having to go through and pick out a ballot. If it's a 2-page ballot, it adds in some complexity.
You kind of led into what I was asking about, curing ballots, mail-in ballots, provisional ballots. Is there a larger chance of errors occurring if there's 2-page ballots, or you have so many people, or one on? I'm just saying, the more paperwork that you're going through, is there more of a chance possibly of errors happening and having to do multiple recounts? I know that's a hypothetical, but I'm just simply saying, as someone that worked as an officer of election, I understand what it entails, and I just really, when you've got 2 pages, well, I don't know, that just seems like a lot of multiple moving parts, but I don't know.
Chair Van Valkenburg, Supervisor Schneider, I think that what I would foresee would be maybe the referenda might, even when people get to the bottom of that and they get to that they might, lose interest. If you had someone who's having to do a mail ballot, they have to remember to stick both pages back into the envelope and not just one. I don't think that it would cause a recount, but I do think that you may have some voters who are missing out on voting for some things because there's a 2-page ballot.
So you're also saying that people like school boards that are not designated as a party might also fall off as far as those elections that are on our ballots on our uneven years right now, and local officials.
Chairman Van Valkenburg, or Supervisor Schneider, I don't want to say people are falling off, but that the attention of voters to vote for those offices might fall off.
Supervisor Lucas Burke.
Good. Thank you. Ms. Bill, thank you for the presentation, and pleasure to meet you. Looking forward to working with you. And all of the conversation that we had about the cost savings, has there been any consideration to those localities that have May elections? And I know that they have the power or the discretion to bring it to their legislators to change their charter. But would that help if those localities that still have May elections move to the November? Would there be any cost savings in those areas?
Chairman Valkenburg, Councilwoman Lucas Burke, I'm not aware of people that still have May elections. I think the law was changed so that everybody has moved to November at this point. But someone can correct me if I'm wrong.
We don't. I thought
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Delegate Bloxham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A question: if a person doesn't return both pages, and I don't know where they saw it, would it be a valid ballot, or would it be considered invalid? Yeah. If they just fill out the first page. No, I tried to. I'm glad it's just not me. So I'll repeat the question: if a person gets an absentee ballot and there are 2 pages, and they only fill out the first page because that's all they care about, is it a valid ballot, or is it considered not valid? I'm not really sure how that would work.
Chair Delegate Bloxham, there is a requirement that we try to cure any absentee ballots that are not correct. So, I mean, there would maybe need to be some legislation passed if we move to 2-page ballots, but certainly the 1 page would still be run through the machine.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner Beals. Next up, I think we have, this will be kind of the longest, the meatiest probably. Now Eric's like, I should never have come. This is the registrars. Eric is the Director of Elections, General Registrar of Prince William County, and he's going to represent the registrars. And so Eric has a presentation, and then we can ask him some questions.
Thank you very much, Chair Van Valkenburg and members of the committee. Appreciate being here today. Is the presentation, there we go. Okay. I am going to get into some numbers. I can tell there's a thirst up there for specific numbers, so I am going to get into that. There is some variability into that. So I am going to talk specifically about numbers today and give you all some meat on that bone to chew on. So I want to mention first that I'm here representing the Voter Registrars Association of Virginia. We're the membership association for the 133 county and city localities around Virginia, and our mission is to promote integrity, transparency, accessibility, and impartiality in running elections across Virginia. My name is Eric Olson. I am the Director of Elections for Prince William County. I've spent about 15 years in elections, and I'm a somewhat unique position there in that I have run elections in DC, Maryland, and Virginia, so I have worked in counties and cities that are on a 2-year cycle and have some familiarity with that. We received a number of different national and state awards related to reducing lines on Election Day, related to expanding transparency. Our county was the first to put results tapes online, and we received an award for that. We also did an open house over the last couple years, so we're doing a lot to try to communicate more to voters, and I'm going to get back to how those things are related to budget a little bit later in the presentation as well, because funding is certainly behind some of those things. And I'm representing our membership organization in this forum today. So talking a little bit at the start about election funding environment and some statistics. So overall expenditures on elections, and these are all going to be fiscal 24 numbers today. Fiscal 25 is the presidential year, so that's going to skew much higher than usual. Fiscal 24 actually skews a little higher than usual because it has that extra presidential primary in it. But we're going to talk a lot about percentages since numbers are ever changing with inflation and new budgets. So of that roughly $100 million in expenditures, about $81 million of that comes from local support and about $18 million comes from state support. So in a typical year, we're talking about $11 million in reimbursement for registrars' salaries and for electoral board support. And then in this particular year, we're talking about $7 million from primary reimbursement, which Commissioner Beals mentioned. So in a typical year, we're talking about our funding pie looking something like 88% support from local funds and about 12% coming from the state to support all of our local election operations. And that is separate and apart from the budget that goes to the State Department of Elections. These are pretty low expenditure levels overall. We're a pretty small portion of the overall budget. So we account for about 0.25% basically of locality expenditures. So for every $403 that's spent at the local level, about $1 goes to elections. We account for our direct support to local election offices accounts for only about 1/3 of state expenditures. So for every $2,800 roughly spent at the state level, we get one of those dollars. Now, we're a real good return on investment. Roughly half of residents interact with their local election office in any given year, whether that's in the act of voting, updating their registration, asking questions about elections, getting communications from our offices. In Prince William County, we're one of about 30 agencies, and we have the second most interactions of any agency in the county. Voting is also considered to be a very favorable activity, so it's very popular with residents. It has a 94% satisfaction rating in our county. I don't think that we are unique in that way. I think that this is something that a lot of residents really love participating in, and it's one of the highest rated activities in our county. So I'm going to make a few points today, and point one is that proper funding of elections not only protects the most foundational American right, but perhaps the most frequent and positive interaction that government has with its citizens, and it costs almost nothing. I know that $100 million is not nothing, but in the scale of things, it is a pretty small amount. I want to talk about some of the funding environment that we're in right now and the things that we are encountering. So in recent years, over the last 5 or 6 years, and I think this is true nationwide, but particularly in Virginia, we have some expanded mandates and compliance requirements that we have to meet. So early voting has been expanded, early in-person voting has been expanded. Mail voting is not, you don't need an excuse anymore, so the number of people using that has really expanded. And we have a ton of increased compliance standards. We have annual security standards that we have to complete each year, looking at more than 150 security requirements of our IT infrastructure and our election equipment to make sure that they are up to snuff and that we are maintaining secure elections in Virginia. We have annual ADA requirements where we have to complete surveys of all of our sites to make sure that they are accessible for people with disabilities. We have expanded training and reporting requirements from the state. And I want to note that I think these are all generally good things. These are all things that broaden convenience for voters. These are all things that improve security, that improve accessibility of elections. So none of these things are negatives, but they are more work and tasks that we have to do as general registrars and our staff and our boards. We're also in an environment with a lot more external demands. So there's public education demands. There's misinformation and disinformation we are constantly dealing with. We've had an explosion in FOIA requests. So in our county in Prince William, we had less than 20 from roughly 2018 to 2020. In 2021, that went to 20. And in the last 3 years, in 2022 through 2024, we've averaged more than 100 FOIA requests. We are a larger staff, so this is something that is more manageable for us. If you're in a smaller locality and you're getting similar numbers or even a portion of that, it's a real burden on the offices. There's also been a lot of focus on officer parity, on making sure that we have one Republican and one Democrat, a one-to-one relationship in our precincts. And that's certainly something in our county we've put more than $20,000 to that effort and actually erased a 2.5 to 1 disparity in that in the past couple of years. But again, it takes money, it takes time, and this is something that while there may be a few counties in Virginia that are relatively even, and this isn't a challenge for, most counties in Virginia are going to lean heavily one way or the other, and it's going to be a real challenge for recruiting minority party office members. So those are all the challenges we're facing, and funding can sometimes be inadequate for that. Some localities don't have enough adequate budget and staffing. I'm not here to complain for myself. I am well supported by my county. We make our case for our county, and we get the funds we need, and we're able to, build some of the programs that I talked about because of that support. And I think that's important because of the factors that we talked about, not just voters going to a polling place and knowing they have their ballot there and us counting those ballots accurately, but also communicating to voters why they shouldn't be concerned about some disinformation that's out there. Explaining to them how our processes work, explaining to them what the steps we take to make sure our elections are secure in Virginia. So some of our smaller localities in particular are struggling for that funding because they're still meeting all these compliance demands. If I am a registrar of a 10,000 voter locality or a 250,000 voter locality, I am completing that compliance survey. I am preparing for board meetings. There are certain functions that my job and other registrars in smaller localities are all having to do regardless of the size of their county. We sometimes encounter, we encountered this inadequate funding in the fiscal year. We're talking about fiscal 24. We were about $4 million short of the state allotted funding. And these aren't, extra funds. These are, we provided all the receipts. This is our ballot printing. These are officers that are there. So in my county, we were short about $246,000. And I know you combine all the counties and it added up to about $4 million. So there are some funding challenges that exist at present. So point 2 is that increased voting convenience, compliance standards, and transparency are popular and broaden access to voting, but they require resources to accomplish in a landscape that's increasingly filled with misinformation. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about, now here's the meat on the bone. So locality budget details. So I grouped our localities into 4 different groups, and most localities in Virginia fall into small categories. There's about 100 counties and cities that are under 40,000 people. Their budgets are typically about $250,000, and their staff is usually only 1 to 3 people. And that includes the general registrar. So there's a lot of staff, localities that only have the registrar and a part-time person or one other person or seasonal people to assist them with all of these responsibilities. As you go up the scale and get to larger counties like mine at the top there, there's a small number of us. We have more than 250,000 voters. We have budgets that are more on the scale of $4 to $5 million, and you're going to have staffs that are going to be in the range of 14 to 15 people. So your variability for funding for elections in each county is really different. It might be somewhere between $10 to $12 in a really large county where you have economies of scale. It might be upwards of $30 per voter per year in a smaller locality. And to answer the question earlier, yes, if you run 2 elections, it is cheaper than running 3 elections in a given year. And if you run 2 elections over 4 years, it is definitively less than running 4 elections. Now, there are some caveats to that, which I'm going to get into, but your math is mathing on that area. So these costs don't include some variable costs, though. So if we have special elections, when I worked in DC and Maryland, we didn't average 2 elections over a 2-year cycle. We usually had about 3, I would say, because a school board member resigns or a supervisor moves into a new position, and sometimes there can be a cascade effect, as I'm sure you all know. There's also periodic capital investments. Every 10 years or so, we have to replace our ADA equipment and our ballot scanners. So in Prince William County, we actually just got funding for that. That was $2.4 million in a county our size, which is a little more than half of our annual budget. So some of these things are pretty significant. If you're talking about local costs, there's going to be a lot of variance factors there. So the administrative structure of the county, how much do they support you in your HR functions and your procurement, or are you doing that on your own? Early voting sites and hours. Most counties just have the one office, and sometimes their staff mans that. But in our situation, we're spending a couple $100,000 a year just on officers to be at a number of sites, because we have Sunday voting in Prince William County, we have evening voting, we have a number of sites that we have for our voters because we're a larger county and we're denser. Mail voting participation levels matter. The types of activities that you're doing matter. If you're doing outreach events to communicate with voters, that can cost more money. And it comes down to structure, too, of full-time or seasonal staff and how you're structuring that. Special populations that you serve. If you have a military base, if you have a college, it's going to cost more. You're going to have more special situations to deal with than the size of your county. So those are all things that vary. So differences in locality structures, costs, and demographics means obviously that the impact of consolidated elections is going to see similar variability across those local counties and cities. So how would consolidated elections change the funding needs? So you all talked about this a little bit earlier, and I've grouped this today into fixed costs and election costs. We're going to talk about that. So in the current election cycle, we have 2 elections per year, and then the fixed costs. And in a consolidated election cycle, we would have those fixed costs, and then we would have either a primary or a general. So it would alternate in terms of the structure of the fiscal year. We would have 1 election in each fiscal year based on putting them in even years. I would note, we'll get into the details of it, that the fixed costs are not going to change tremendously. You might see a slight change in a large county like mine, where we might say, well, we have 18 full-time employees. We might be able to do a 17 or 16 and a half. I don't think you're going to see much in most of the state. In fact, I think that's a pretty strong concern of a lot of registrars, is that you might have local supervisors who are going to look at this and go, we have half the elections, you have 2 people, we're just going to give you 1 person, and you're going to have to accomplish elections, which is a problem, not only because that doesn't work in general, but that especially doesn't work in the environment that we're in right now. So fixed costs, those are our required annual expenditures, and election costs are costs incurred only when elections are scheduled, printing ballots, paying officers to work the polls, things like that. So fixed costs include salary and benefits of employees, capital expenditures for facilities, IT infrastructure, so the computer and the licensing costs that we have to run an office, our office supplies and our copiers, voter registration activities, those happen year-round, administrative activities, those happen year-round. So there's a ton of those things that are ongoing, as Commissioner Beals noted, particularly for the state. Election costs are going to include your ballot printing, your mail voting supplies, postage and labor, your equipment programming and delivery, your election officer payments, candidate management, and then seasonal staffing, which in our county, and I think this is fairly common, we have roughly the same number of seasonal employees that come in for as temps during an election cycle for about 6 to 10 weeks before an election as we do full-time employees. That's not a rule, but I think it's a pretty common thing that you'll see in elections. So here's a sample budget with a little bit of detail on how our budget in Prince William County breaks out for fixed costs versus election costs. And again, this is in fiscal 24 where we have 2 primaries, so those election costs might be tweaked up a little bit, but a presidential is going to be more, and it's going to be balanced out. So I think there is, it's a decent measuring stick here. So you can see about $2 million of our budget, so just a little under half, goes just to salary and benefits. IT and facility costs, that's almost $500,000. There's always some overtime. We have to work during early voting on weekends, election days. There are deadlines when we're mailing out ballots and things like that. I think you will find, I have to say I'm very impressed by Virginia across the board. Our overtime costs are probably a third of what you see and what I saw when I was in Maryland. And it's really impressive considering the additional compliance requirements in our environment. For election costs, so looking at Prince William here, you see over 3 elections, officer payments cost us almost $600,000. Contractor services, so we have vendors that take care of our mail ballots. In a lot of jurisdictions, that's done in-house, and that's really going to vary by locality. Seasonal employees is about $300,000. Mail votings, that's mostly postage there, is about $60,000 because the other aspects of this are handled under our contractor services, and then some miscellaneous costs. So you're breaking down basically about 2/3 and 1/3 here, 65% and 35%. Now, we had several localities break down their costs, and our budgets are not set up as fixed cost election costs. So we had to break down these budget categories that we use with our localities, and some of them are very, if we have a line for ballot printing, then that makes it very easy. But some of them are going to be staff-related, seasonal staff. We have to kind of break down, okay, we have some temp staff that actually stay with us for most of the year, and then other temp staff that are only there for 6 or 8 weeks with us. So we had 4 registrars in different localities break this down, and in mine, which was around 300,000 voters, you can see 35% is our election costs. In a couple different localities that were around 75,000 voters, another around 30,000 voters, it was around 26% of election costs. And as you got really small locality that had only 10,000 voters, only about 11%. So what you're going to generally see is that as you go larger, those election costs are going to be bigger. And this makes sense because if you're talking about an office that only has 1.5 employees, then that's going to be a big portion of your budget, and that's not going to change because you can't send that person home in an off year and say, well, your job will be back in the even year. There's a lot of preparation that comes into this process beforehand. So when we're talking about potential savings, I think the fixed costs are the largest area of local expenditures, and you're going to see minimal savings in that. So I do think there's a possibility for that, but I wouldn't want to set any expectation for you all that there's going to be significant fixed cost savings. I think those are there. The smaller the locality, the larger the portion of the budget is fixed costs. Election costs would drop each year. So you can basically take that election cost portion of the budget and say, in election years, you're going to have to pay out that in full. And in non-election years, that's going to go to zero outside of special funding for a special election, which is usually done at the local level. We appeal to the supervisors and tell them what our budget is for that particular election and then have that approved. I would estimate that we're talking about in fiscal $24, so these obviously have gone up a little bit. Your statewide savings is going to be about $15 million out of that $100 million. That is sort of extrapolating those percentages at those different levels across all of those budgets. You're obviously going to save more in some of the large localities like mine. And then as you get to the small localities, you're talking about really small differences in savings. It could potentially be a little less than that. I think it's a range, and it's going to depend on the year. But I think 15 million is a good sort of starting point. It could be as low as 11 or 12. It could be as high as 25 potentially, depending on a lot of different factors. And certainly something that we could provide some more data on, have some more registrars generate some reports on how their fixed costs and election costs break out. So point 4 here, consolidated elections would cost less money, but the savings might be lower than expected and diminish as the locality gets smaller in population. And again, I know a big concern among registrars is half the election, half the costs, and some of the effects that this has at the local level where the registrars really need to be focused on running the election. And when you have an office where you're only 1 or 2 people and you're spending a lot of your time arguing to get budget to do basic functions that you need to do, that potentially threatens the problem. And that is an instance where the state could mitigate that concern and look at legislation or options that would reach that. So some overall considerations just related to budget impact. Consolidation advantages, obviously you reduce the annualized election costs. So those would drop in half for a 4-year cycle because every other year you're not paying them out. Some costs and processes related to planning, training, and compliance could be shifted to non-election years. So some of those surveys that I talked about doing, the ADA surveys, the less compliance, that could be looked at more as a off-cycle task where you have more time to really focus on it, which I think would not only shift those costs a little bit better, and there you might see a little reduction in your fixed costs, but it would allow those tasks to be done better too, because right now they're difficult to get in. So I apologize to Commissioner Beals because we're often late on some of those. And that's simply because we're trying to run elections and get all those things done. And it's really tough to meet all those timelines, as she mentioned earlier about landing the helicopter on with the pin of a needle or what it was. So savings, one note about this is that savings that are reinvested, when I talked about some of those concerns and those issues that we're facing, those savings could be reinvested in the process. So if you kept the budget levels the same, you could actually meet some of those needs and some of those problems that we're having in terms of communicating with the public about issues that they're reading in the media. And when politics sometimes, we work in elections, but we stay out of politics. Politics sometimes comes crashing through our doors, and we have to explain to people how these processes work. So those funds could go towards making the process not only better, but making the public more aware of how these things work and providing public education. So some concerns, again, the one I just talked about, budget's still catching up to increased convenience and compliance demands and how that interacts. Some election costs that was mentioned earlier could potentially increase in election years. So if you have a multi-page ballot that gets created, that could become a problem. If you have elections, maybe depending on your early voting site where it's a little small and then the elections are a little more spread out now, that could be something you are handling only once every 4 years in the presidential. You might have to figure out how to do that twice in a 4-year cycle. Special election costs could increase. Obviously, they sometimes align with elections that are existing. They sometimes do not presently, but you could have some special election costs that increase. And you may lose some knowledge and efficiency with a possible shift to more seasonal staff. And again, that is sort of anticipating how some supervisor boards might look at this and go, "Oh, we're going to save this money now," which that can be a good thing. Obviously, we are trying to be great stewards of the taxpayers' dollars, and I think we talked about the value that we provide. But if you have too much of that shift, if you take too many full-time staff away and you try to move things to seasonal workers, you lose some of that knowledge, you lose some of that expertise. And I think that one of the ways that Virginia's elections are really working well and overcoming some of those concerns that I talk right now is we have a real all-star team of 133 registrars and their staff around the state. They do a really fantastic job. And having worked in both Maryland and DC and Virginia, I can tell you that the skill level and the expertise level of the registrars in this state is really off the charts. And it's their blood, sweat, and tears that really pushes this process over the edge a lot of times. So some mitigation steps if this was implemented, to ensure that could relieve some of those concerns. Minimum locality staffing levels. So I know that's been proposed at times, looking at adding a second, a deputy registrar at all localities. That would be one way to sort of mitigate that concern registrars have. State funding to cover increased compliance and voter registration needs. So some state funding could bridge that gap. Modifications to early voting. One of the concerns is that early voting sites right now, you have to have early voting in your office. And I can say that I know there's offices that if you consolidate the elections are going to have some trouble with that. I can say that in Prince William County, in my county, our office is literally 2 miles from any voter, and unless you're in the jail, you are 2 miles because we are on a little island in the middle of Manassas City. But because we're required to have that office open, our location is not the most convenient, which our supervisors and our electoral board might look at a better location for that would meet larger election demands if you looked at modifying it from just that office. And then looking at maybe ways to consolidate special elections or make that process. I think that's an existing challenge for us. And so continuing to look at that in relation to consolidated elections would be another area. So final point here, VRAP does not take a position related to consolidated elections. I'm sure if you ask some registrars, some would be very for it and some would not like it. But we don't take a position on this issue. We do take a position on some administrative matters that we observe, but we try to stay out of politics, obviously. We think that with careful planning, modification of ancillary laws, and proper fiscal support, that you could implement this and alleviate both existing and potential challenges that might be there in the future. And certainly, as someone that coming from DC and Maryland, I know that elections in a 2-year cycle is certainly possible, given that the vast majority of states do it that way. But there are some considerations that I hope I covered today that relate to Virginia and maybe illuminate some of the fiscal realities of what those savings would potentially be and how they might potentially be used. So,
all right, thank you, Eric. That was great. And we've got a long queue of questions for you.
Okay.
So Senator Sturple, we'll start with you.
Thanks. I've got 3 questions. And first of all, I just want to say thank you, Mr. my mic turns off. For what you guys do every day, and not just you, but also all the other registrars in the state. I know, especially in the environment the last few years, you all have been under a lot more pressure, politically, publicly, a lot of other ways, threats and everything else. And so we appreciate what you do to keep our elections safe and transparent. So on the special election piece, isn't it fair to say that whether or not there needs to be a special election is to some extent for local offices up to the locality? For example, for a board of supervisors, the board of supervisors could adjust whatever their rules are to let the board choose a replacement pending the next general versus demanding to have a special election as soon as possible to cost taxpayers money. So like Commonwealth attorneys, I think maybe operate the same way. I think the judges can sometimes pick the temporary CA until there's a general, same thing with the clerk and others. So isn't there an element of choice in terms of avoiding increased cost for special elections with regard to localities in many situations?
Yeah, certainly it's outside of our control, and it depends on the particular position that you're talking about and the particular type of special elections. And in certain cases that they're required. In certain cases, you can appoint until, to align it with another general election. So I was mentioning that to note that there might be opportunities in the law to close some of those gaps and make it a little bit more uniform potentially. And yes, there's certainly a lot of local choice in how to proceed with those.
Okay. Second question I have. Is it fair to say that because the bulk of the local costs are fixed and not variable, that if elections are consolidated and there's higher turnout, that the system becomes a more efficient use of dollars? I understand the overall dollars go down, but for example, it seems to me that in a presidential election, we spend less per voter than we do in the year that the Senate runs, when turnout craters to 30%. It seems to me we're spending a lot more per voter to have an election than we are in a presidential election, when all those fixed costs are spread out amongst 2.5 times more voters. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, I think your math is accurate on that, and I think that if you're looking at just to generalize, if a presidential is around 75%, if a gubernatorial or a midterms are around 50%, and if local elections are closer to 25%, so kind of a quarter, half, 3/4, if you consolidate elections, you're not going to suddenly have 95% turnout and 75%. You might see a little bit of a change. You might have an election that typically would have been about 50% that might have 55% because there's a bond issue of interest or that might bring out some voters. But I think your maximum turnout elections that you're seeing now you're probably going to see very similar numbers in a consolidated election system.
Third question. It's probably not even a question. It's probably more of a statement, but your presentation reminded me of, we get these fiscal impact statements that only focus on cost and never focus on the benefits of anything. And I remember I once had a case. I was suing a charity. I'm not going to say which one, but it was pointed out to me in the evidence that we were focusing on all these numbers on a budget, but what we had not focused on was the time of the volunteers. And going along with what I think was Delegate Price said, or what Delegate Helmer said, Delegate Price said, it doesn't. One of the things I think we're missing in terms of looking at the cost is that what it costs our voters. Because we have 4.3 million people that voted in the last presidential, 3.2 voted in the last gubernatorial. But if we have elections every single year, we have 3-4 million people, whatever, that have to take an hour, 2-3 hours of their life out to sit down, focus on what they're going to be doing when they walk into the polling place, get in their car, walk, get in the bus, whatever, drive down there, sit, wait in line, whatever. And so if 4 million people have to spend 2-3 hours of their life every single year going through this effort, say I don't know what the value of people's time is. I know what the free market puts on mine as an attorney, which is not really representative, but say the average person is their time is worth, say, $20-25 an hour, right? Getting all these Virginians into the polling place every year costs them about $160 million, $200 million of their time to focus on election and vote every year. And that's a cost that we avoid if we consolidate these elections. And, that dwarfs all the numbers we're talking about. Isn't that a fair statement?
So delegate attorney, I can verify the statement.
Okay.
Costs, one of the things I was trying to allude to is that you not only have and I think this is kind of a similar point to what you were making, is that you not only have the actual costs, but what are the costs of not doing more voter education out there with our citizens? What are the costs of how many people are not participating that might be? How many people are not, one of the things that goes along with more convenience is that people get more confused. They have more options than they've ever had, really, to vote. You can vote by mail, you can vote early, you can vote election day. It's more options than really have ever been available. It's really only in the last 15 or 20 years of history in this country that people have had those. That takes a lot of education. People get confused. They show up all the time to early voting sites on election day thinking they can vote there, and they can't. So we do a lot to try to, to educate our voters on that and provide them with those options. We still get questions, obviously, but I think that is something that needs to be done more. And there is a cost, there's a real cost to that, to not doing some of those things.
Thanks.
Delegate Helmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, first of all, I thank Mr. Olson again for this excellent presentation. I think the best we've had. Just one thing I wanted to understand. I'm going to go through a few different questions. The first thing is, I think you made mention of significant increased costs of administering elections, even on a per capita basis. I think most of that sounds like it's driven by the changes we made in 2020 to the law. So we've increased the amount of early voting, and I think there's lots to be talked about there. The law seems to be relatively stable at this point, and I just wanted to know the extent to which you anticipate the non-state legislative costs related to elections in terms of election security, federal requirements, things like that. Do you think it's stabilized? Do you think it's going to go up? Just because that helps us to think about how we would think about those variable costs over time and how important it is that we mitigate them.
Yeah, I think we've seen some stability in that. I think what you typically see on the bureaucratic side of things is that when legislation gets passed, the money that goes along with executing that administration usually comes along in subsequent years. So someone has a good idea and they implement something, and then the money sort of takes time to develop. And in this case, if the state is implementing a standard of some kind, whether that is the Department of Elections with an administrative rule or a state legislative action, it then falls on us to sort of communicate that to our localities and get funding for it, because in some instances we're talking about things that don't really cost that much time and effort and money. In other instances we're talking about things that cost a tremendous amount of money and time. I think we are seeing some leveling off or dropping off in some of the sort of election integrity, but it's hard to know where that goes long term. And I think that the velocity of change in our society continues to increase, and it becomes hard to both anticipate what the next problem will be, and it also comes at us real fast sometimes. And when you have a set budget and a smaller budget, it's really hard to combat and handle some of those things.
Since I'm temporarily the chair, I'll take the chair's prerogative to ask my next question, which is one of the things we've heard talked about is the concern about referenda related to bonds. And since you have experience in other states, just speaking in your capacity, where special election, is it fair for us to assume if we were going to maintain the ability of localities, which I think we would likely do, to do off-year elections for bond-related issues and things like that because they need to from a fiscal sense? Is your sense from your experience in other states that we can anticipate something akin to a special election turnout for those steps?
I think so. I mean, that or smaller, both because you tend to get lower turnout for those really specific local issues. And also sometimes people read a whole bond thing and they go, I'm not sure what this means, and it discourages them from potentially voting.
The real chair is Mr. Chair, I got a couple more questions. Just in terms of the costs you presented to us, is that solely the costs that are borne by the register in terms of elections? Two things, and this is probably for the budget staff as well, that I'm aware of. One is schools do shut down we've moved the general election, so it probably causes less disruption to the schools, but the primary elections do still take place during the school year. Does that, do we actually impact are there costs that are borne by the education system? And then I guess with that, I do know that we made a state holiday out of, my recollection is that we have made a state holiday out of Election Day, unless I remember wrong. And I'm just wondering across all state agencies, which are presumably who respects that state holiday, is there a positive fiscal impact by essentially bringing back a 8-hour workday every other year, or if that's something we need to look at? So one is the schools, how they factor into the costs and the extended school year and everything else, and second is the impact of the state, essentially one less state holiday a year.
Yeah, I think whether the schools are open or closed, and in Prince William, the schools are closed generally on both our June election and the November election. They're not open that day, which is, I think it's primarily a security issue. I don't think the cost issue is significantly high at all. There might be a really small, minute cost borne by the schools for things they have to do to prepare for that, but on our end, it's not a factor.
We can hit the budget people last. And then the last question I had, since the presidential primary consolidation has come up a few times, so just take liberty of having you here while we're talking about election consolidation writ large to ask, I know you presented some concerns about the variability of staff, seasonability of staff, all of that kind of thing. If we went from 1 year to 2 years, on the proposal that Senator Van Valkenburg and I had and that passed both chambers of the General Assembly was to move the state, local, federal primaries, non-presidential primaries on presidential primary years to the presidential primary date. What I believe is looking at those variable costs that you presented, those actually would decrease. They would decrease fairly linearly because you're not really extending there's not going to be more ballot, there's not going to be more mail or anything like that. Is that a fair assessment? Is that essentially you would take all your variable costs in a presidential year where you did end up with an extra primary and decrease it by the cost of one election?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. And I think in terms of talking about how you're not going to have turnout that's going to be much higher, I think the only thing when we're talking about a possible multi-card ballot, and I've been part of elections that had 2-card ballots and 3-card ballots. Someone asked the point earlier, does that cause some issue? It causes a little bit of a challenge. You have if you start off with 10,000 ballots, you get 10,000 first pages. You get, you'll lose 30 second pages and 50, and some of that's just people deciding they're not interested in the contest. So it doesn't necessarily mean there was an issue. Maybe they just, rather than not voting in that contest like you might on certain down ballot races or even up ballot races, you just get rid of the piece of paper instead of not voting that ballot. So it's not really that much different. But in terms of the costs related to those turnout issues, I think when you have those multi-card ballots, the only thing is you're going to have voters that are going to be at a voting booth for longer. So of site that might have worked in the current election system, you're probably going to have some localities that are going to have to look at how that impacts, because it's all a logistical, how long does it take someone to check in? How long do they vote the ballot? How long does it take to scan it? And aligning all those variables so that the process goes smoothly. But it's certainly, it's accomplishable. It's logistics, but I think that some of the early voting, the limitations of the current early voting law are something that may need to be looked at to provide it. You know, in our case, we have a very small main office, and a lot of offices are not built for that kind of stuff. It would be good if we had the option to select a different facility that was maybe more suited to handle voters taking longer on a ballot and more voters coming in. So,
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yep. Thank you. Delegate Price, you're next, but I know Delegate Bloxham has to leave, so we'll let him go real quick, and then it'll be Delegate Price and Mr. Howard after Delegate Price.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. The slide deck that you showed the cost of the 24 election, would it be possible to put in a slide deck of what it cost in 2020 before we implemented a lot of the enhancements to elections, just for comparison's sake? And I'll just say that I find it very refreshing that we're really worried about unfunded mandates when a esteemed gentleman told me in the committee room that we are the committee of unfunded mandates. So just to throw that out there, but I would love to see a comparison over time of the cost of elections. Thank you.
I think I'm coming back in September to talk to you guys more about the administrative functions, so I'd be happy to come back.
Please, thank you.
Additional figures, I'd be happy to come back with some additional things, because I think we're still kind of looking at this preliminarily, so, you know, refining those numbers is something we can continue to do.
Final comment, I just think holistically, when we're looking at this, I think that puts some stuff in perspective. I think that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With the answer that you just gave about the consolidation of the primary, potentially, or whatever, I just wanted to make sure that the number of machines that you all decide, is that based off population, or is that based off that expedience factor that you don't want long lines in that sense? Like, is it up to you all how many machines you get?
It's up to us as long as we get the budget for them.
Oh, understood. Understood. But
when we make recommendations, those are followed. Sometimes they're not followed other times. So a really good example, we're getting new equipment now in Prince William County. One of the features of our new equipment is it's going to allow voters to confirm their ballot selections. And one of the things that as we're thinking that through, is that's going to mean voters are going to be taking longer when they get to that scanner. So to actually increase the number of scanners we've had in anticipation of that, where we only had one before, we may need two, where we had two, we may need three. So we look at those, those logistics, and there's some really good research out there. MIT has a really great tool where you can put in a number of voters and get a sense of what your lines would be like with the number of voting booths and scanners and things that you've got. So we ask for them to, in an ideal situation, but we don't always get funding for that, and then that can create problems. So I think it kind of goes with the theme I mentioned earlier, which is that, sometimes in planning for these things, if we're not getting the funding and the resources we need, then you're going to end up with voters that aren't sure, where they're supposed to go to vote, or you're going to end up with lines at a scanner in a polling place. Because really, once you get through that check-in at the polling place, everything else is just a math problem, and it should go through smooth. But if you haven't gotten the scanners you needed, or the number of voting booths you've needed, or you don't have the space for those things, then that's when the challenges can come up.
Yeah. Okay. So I think I would like, to the best of your ability, understanding that each locality makes budget decisions, right? But to the best of your ability, and with your authority to order more machines should you be funded, I would be interested in some reflection on how many registrars think that they would need more machines with those 2 pages. And then, because I think what we're trying to do is put the things that would increase cost in one column. Like, so, they're different variables and different things, but I want to make sure that we're considering all of those variables. And Mr. Chair, I had 2 more questions. In that, also, when you're breaking down the numbers, not asking for it right now, but asking for it in September, is it possible, when you listed out some of the cost concerns that you have, is it possible for you to get an estimate figure on what your locality or any of the member localities spend specifically for ADA compliance? That was listed. And then if you could give us an idea, is that website accessibility? Is that is that accessibility at the actual registrar's office? Is that early voting? Is that precincts? I would love to get a little bit more information on that. So should there be a day when we're not having to backfill the chaos from the federal level and we wanted to put more money to elections, I think that's something that, it should be a bipartisan desire to make sure that voting is as compliant as possible. And then I just have one last question. In your functions right now, I can imagine that you obviously have a passion for this, so I'm not asking for you specifically, but registrars in general, that it would probably be hard to prioritize outreach when you are dealing with all of the mandates that you listed on the other slide. How would you characterize in our doing the pros and cons, how would you answer the fact that you would then be able to do potentially more outreach? So when we're talking about 2-page ballots, when we're talking about folks that want to do ranked choice or, whatever these things are that potentially in that off year, could you imagine that outreach would be easier if you weren't also administering 2 to 3 elections that year as well?
Yeah, I think, one advantage that I noted was that the off-year elections, you would have more time to do outreach, compliance, and a number of factors. And, my experience in Maryland and DC was that when we didn't have elections and we didn't have a special, we would have usually 6 months to work on those type of things, to send staff out to do surveys of accessibility at polling places, to rebuild our training manual to address concerns that came up in the previous election. And, right now that all happens on the fly, and it happens while we're trying to run the next election. And I know that, I know in my staff, we've talked about needing staff that are focused on the current election and also having staff that are kind of doing more long view stuff that's continuous. Well, if you only have 1 or 2 people, obviously that component of it is not happening, and is a real challenge. So I think my fervor for elections is not unique to me or my county. I think it's pretty common across the board, and I think that there are a lot of other. We just had our conference a few weeks ago, and a lot of other registrars I talked to said we would love to do some of the things that you're doing. We don't have the money, time, resources to do that.
Delegate Price.
I don't know that this is a question. I'll try to fit one in there. But in the Voting Rights Act of Virginia, there was a Virginia Outreach and Education Fund. And there were potentially the folks that might be sued for having done voter disenfranchisement or something, the funds would go towards that. I would wonder if you had your druthers and had just a pot of money that could go towards grants for outreach. What are some of the things you or your colleagues would be able to do more of in that on the ground outreach to voters?
Well, I think, we do a lot of stuff. We obviously have a website and Twitter that we give people information on. Not everybody has access to that. So, and I think when you talk about, underserved communities, you're talking about really urban areas and really rural areas, in my experience over the years. And we're kind of in an age where it's kind of like the voting convenience options. There's so many options, but how do you explain them to people? There's so many ways to reach people, but how do you make sure you reach everyone? So just putting up all the information on our website is great for a lot of voters. But we've also been trying to do and squeezing budget dollars to do a voter guide that we send out to every address in our county that explains to them what their options are. Because not everybody's going to go on the internet. Not everyone's going to go on the internet and think to look for that information. And so we try to put that in front of them, more often, and it's paid dividends. Voting is a favorable activity in our county, but it actually was the best growth of any activity in our county over the last 3 or 4 years. So those activities definitely have an impact, and so more outreach I think would be something that a lot of counties. I could probably find a laundry list of registrars if you'd want me to for the next time of what are some of the things that if the savings were a reinvestment what are some of those things that would be on that list. I can certainly go back and retrieve that wish list.
Delegate Price.
Thank you. I think you have shown one of the things I like to say, there's announcements and then there's outreach, right? If you're putting information somewhere that people don't know where to go get it, that's an announcement, right? But outreach is really taking that information to the people. And so that idea of reinvesting the savings and not just, I know that there are lots of other things that city council folks like to spend money on. But I do want to keep that at the forefront of our minds when we're thinking about savings. It's not necessarily not being spent, but money that could be spent on other things to save our democracy. Thank you.
Almost done, Mr. Olson. Mr. Howard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Eric, good to see you again.
I see you.
One thing that hasn't been mentioned is how do you foresee the list maintenance being different from yearly or every 6 months elections to biannual elections? I know when I was in office, that was one of the main ways that we can maintain our voter rolls and keep a clean roll. Do you see that as being different going forward if we were to go for a 2-year cycle?
I mean, I don't think so. I kind of echo Commissioner Beals on that there's some of these ongoing functions. We send out roughly, we do about 100,000 either record updates or mailings in any given year. It fluctuates a little bit, but in a slow year, we're doing 70,000. In a busy year, we're doing 120,000 of those. So that's an ongoing cost regardless. And that's when I talked about how that fixed cost area, it doesn't have a lot of wiggle room. Voter registration is one of the main reasons. Our largest group of full-time staff in our office is our registration team. So that makes up a quarter of my office alone. And then the rest of the teams focus on either administration or election operations, preparations, or mail voting. So I don't think you're going to see much difference year over year to the registration component of that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wasn't necessarily talking fiscal.
Oh, okay.
I know Virginia has been lauded. Sorry. I know Virginia's been lauded for having very clean voter rolls. And I believe one of the main reasons for that is because we do have elections so often. We know that, 75% or so of most of the list maintenance things comes through the DMV. However, we also know that a lot of people don't change their addresses with DMV, don't update their licenses. And we get a lot of those types of updates through your election day processes. Is it possible that the voter rolls could suffer if we were to go to a biennium?
I think most of the answers that I'm going to give you guys on these questions is going to be yes and no. So yes, by not having so many elections, you might reduce some opportunities for that. The flip side of that would be if you have a year where you're not administering 2 elections or you're not administering any elections, what does that potentially open up for improving your voter registration activities, and what processes could you put in place to either mitigate that change or add new programs that you now have the time and the resources to invest in? So I think that I think you're right, and I also think that there's other things that you could do as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One more question. The current voting machine systems here in Virginia, through the various vendors, has the association reached out to those vendors to see if those machines could handle a much longer or double-sized ballot? Most of them, I believe, can, but have you looked at the increased cost in postage for, rather than 1 ballot page per year, 2 ballot pages the next year? I know our postage costs went up when we had a long ballot. Would the association also take a look at the additional time that it would take for a presidential turnout to go through an election with double the campaigns and possible referendums? I know that we've been having constitutional amendments every couple of years here in Virginia. Where would those go? And we know that a lot of voters will have questions when they get to those referendums. And of course, they turn to our officers who have to explain that we really can't help you. So what sort of time increase is it going to cost the voter from going every November to just every other November?
Yeah, so I think your formula here for costs is your fixed costs minus half your election costs plus whatever's clawed back a little bit in those special situations. So if you do have an election where you have a ballot that is 2 cards, your cost there would be obviously just the number of pages you have to print. It's not going to be a double the cost situation, but it might be 60 or 70% more because you do get some discounts as you go higher in volume. So you're going to have that. You're going to have a labor cost there where when you're opening up mail ballots and you're putting the ballots through scanners, now it takes just a little bit longer. So I don't think those are huge costs, but I think they are significant, and I think they are something to look at when you're looking at that formula of how much of the election costs do you save, because a little bit will get clawed back in certain situations based on some of the examples that you presented, and that would be a good reason. I know in the first session you all looked at sort of what would this change be like in terms of adding a year or taking a year away, and in terms of aligning these cycles, and maybe that would be a consideration when you're doing that to sort of try to mitigate one particular year having too much in it, although I know some of that with bond issues and things is not within your control.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Olson, for all of your work on this. It was a very good presentation and really hit a lot of what I wanted to say. But one thing that we know coming from a small locality, one of the 99 of 133, that is a very tiny locality. Once your budget drops, you don't get that back. Yeah. And that is a huge concern for me, that if a city manager comes into a city, small county administrator comes into a small county, they see you don't have an election this November. Okay, we're going to claw your budget back. Then the next budget cycle, well, you didn't spend the money that we gave you anyway, so we're going to leave you flat. And that is a huge concern of mine. And unless the state, the powers that be, can create a system for those localities to fund that during election year, a mandate, and we know that P&E committees are the unfunded mandated committees. And there are plenty of unfunded mandates that boards of supervisors and city councils simply would like to ignore. So we need more from the Commonwealth, that rather than being a paper tiger, this tiger needs some real teeth to make sure that those small localities will maintain their funding regardless. So that more of a comment, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much.
All right.
I think that concern echoes what a lot of our membership would say, that concerns about this, how this would change funding, and then what are the levers that stabilize that in terms of percentages of budget or number of staff and things that can mitigate that at the legislative level.
All right, so I'm just going to ask a summary question, and you can say yes or no. You can caveat it. You can disagree with me, and then you can go sit down because I think all the questions have been asked. What I'm hearing, to kind of sum all this up, is math is still math, so elections are going to be cheaper. Okay, you are going to have a more balanced schedule in that you might be able to move things around that you are having to constantly do at the same time, but that there are worries if we were to move about how that would negatively impact you that we should address, right? And one of those as Mr. Howard just talked about, is kind of local budgets. Some of that is around kind of state resources to help you maybe with volunteers or some other type of thing. But that at the end of the day, if we were to make the move, elections would be cheaper, you would have a more balanced schedule, and then we have to make the political decision of, is this the right thing to do by voters? Is this the right thing to do by governance, right? Is this the right thing to do for Virginia writ large?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty fair summary, Mr. Chair. And I think that our membership would be concerned that we would want to see some mitigating measures in that, in that effort and in that final product of consolidating the elections to make sure that especially our small localities are not suffering from having to make the case for the budget while managing elections and some of that transition. So what's the opportunity for reinvestment there? And certainly, yes, there would be cost savings, and we would make the case that there should be some reinvestment and some things to make sure that we stabilize the people that are running our elections and that we continue to have secure and accurate elections in Virginia.
Well, I'll speak for myself. I agree with that. So, one vote. All right. Thank you, Mr. Elson, for your time. And we have one last presentation.
Thank you so much.
Last but not least, maybe like everybody brought up questions. Okay, thank you. My name is John Nunley. I'm chair of the Caroline County Electoral Board, and I'm president of the Virginia Association of Electoral Boards. And I'm going to be very quick, because I think most of it's been said, and we don't need to dwell on what's been said. What I will, well, number one, VIBA does not take a position on legislation. We see our role as advisory, things that might affect how the election runs. And I want to say the biggest thing that I don't think's been hit on enough today is the difference between size of jurisdictions. In preparation for this, I spoke with my board of supervisors and said, if we went to even year elections, how would that affect our office? And right now we have a registrar and one deputy. And they said, well, we don't see a need for a deputy in a year that you don't have elections. So we're going to lose a lot of that institutional knowledge with that, and maybe there's a way to protect that, and that's fine. But I think that's a real concern, and I think it concerns a lot of smaller jurisdictions. The other thing is, one of the benefits of having it every 6 months is we train our officers of election routinely. So even when we bring new people on, you still have historical knowledge there that, makes the precinct go smoothly. If we went a complete year, you're basically starting from scratch. And I think that's just an uphill battle. And I'll just use the example of when our kids didn't go to school during COVID. It took a while to get them back in the routine. And then I don't think we can underestimate any. Again, I'm going back to the size because Fairfax County has reminded me several times how long their ballot is to start with and how long it would be. And, a simpler ballot is simpler for everybody. And that's all I have.
All right, a couple questions for you, Delegate Helmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Really appreciate the speaker. Mr. Chair, I just ask, do you have a sense in your conversations with counties in other states or election boards in other states, just how do they deal with this? So in 46 states, they do have an election every other year. There is a high degree of variability, obviously, and some states do it really well, some localities do it really well, some don't. Do they just do all year training to cover the gap? I mean, I do see states and localities that don't have lines outside of Virginia. I do think we are excellently administered. I just wonder how they have addressed the gap and if you've thought at all about what are the changes the electoral boards would make.
I have not had contact with other states. I have enough to keep myself busy in this state.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, if we do make this shift, I do think we'll have to think about what are the lessons learned and things we can bring from the 46 other states that don't run every year elections to help make sure we do address some of these gaps in training and things like that.
Delegate Price.
I'm trying. Sorry, I just wanted to interject in response to Delegate Helmer's question and just let folks know that Mr. Chair and I sat beside each other at the pre-conference for the National Conference of State Legislatures when they had a full day, but one of the topics was consolidation, and there is a report on potential cost savings and a report on what other states are doing available in NCSL. So with your permission, Mr. Chair, I would like to submit that for that to be added into, the records that we're looking at to just have as for consideration.
Yeah, that's we'll have that added. That's a good idea. Mr. Levy.
Thank you for your presentation. I really always enjoy hearing you, Mr. Donnelly. If the state were to mandate a deputy position and fund it, what effect would that have on the election administration system in Virginia?
Having a historic, and I'm coming from a position where I've been on the board now for about 12 years, and I'm on my third registrar. Having that long-term knowledge is so important, and having to train a new registrar twice now has been, daunting. So yes, I'm a firm believer that we should have a required deputy in every jurisdiction, and that they have the same knowledge as the registrar, so that if something were to happen, someone can step in on day one.
All right. I think you going last was good, right? All right. I think unless anybody has anything else, that'll be it for meeting 3. Meeting 4 is going to be about running elections. We're going to see some of the same people, and we'll see some new presenters as well. And this is just a reminder. I think this meeting was also good for learning more about what we would want to think about when we think about what goes into constitutional amendment, when we think about what goes into law, when we think about what goes into the budget. I think this meeting helped us kind of further refine what that needs to be when we think about that. But just as a reminder, this next meeting in September will be our last informational meeting, at which point we'll take a session break and an election break, and then we will come back next spring and summer to start pondering language. And so just to kind of remind everybody where we are in the process. And Delegate Price?
Yes, I have received questions. Is there a place where people can put their thoughts, public comment? Where should we direct folks to go for that, other than my email? I welcome all emails. I welcome all.
We'll get something up so that people can do public comment.
Because on the House side, we have a site. So just wondering what the Senate does.
We'll get something going for public comment, and we'll make note of that at the next meeting as well, and widely distribute it. And so with that, we're adjourned.
This is the Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia.